The boy who never dried, his pus-covered flesh that spread panic through the Appalachians. This is the story that was buried for decades, hidden in the fog-shrouded valleys of eastern Kentucky, where the Coddle family lived and suffered in ways that would haunt every person who crossed their path. In the autumn of 1937, a traveling nurse named Margaret Ellen Whitmore made a routine visit to what locals called Coddle Hollow, a remote stretch of land nestled between Pine Mountain and the Black Mountain Range in Letcher County. The Great Depression had ravaged these mountains, but poverty was nothing new to the families who had lived here for generations. What Margaret found that October morning, however, would change her understanding of human suffering forever. The Coddle family had inhabited this hollow since before the Civil War. They arrived sometime in the 1820s. A single patriarch named Ezekiel Coddle and his wife, settling into the isolation that the Appalachian Mountains offered. For over a century, this family had remained almost entirely cut off from the outside world. The nearest town, Whitesburg, sat nearly 20 miles away over treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during the harsh winter months. The Coddles had no reason to leave, and the outside world had no reason to come to them. Margaret Whitmore had been warned about the Coddles before her visit. The other families in the region spoke of them in hushed tones, crossing themselves when their name was mentioned. They called them the Hollow People, a clan so isolated that they had become something other than ordinary mountain folk. But Margaret was a practical woman, trained in Louisville and hardened by years of treating the poorest communities in Appalachia. She did not believe in superstition. The morning fog hung thick over the hollow as Margaret guided her mule along the narrow path. The trees here grew differently than elsewhere in the mountains, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward each other across the path like skeletal fingers desperate to touch. Snowbirds sang in Coddle Hollow. Margaret noticed this absence immediately, the unnatural silence broken only by the soft thud of her mule's hooves on the damp earth. She smelled the Coddle homestead before she saw it, a thick, putrid odor that reminded her of rotting meat and infected wounds, but somehow worse, more pervasive, as if the very air had been poisoned. Margaret covered her nose with her handkerchief and pressed forward. The homestead consisted of 3 wooden structures built around a central clearing. The main cabin, clearly the original dwelling, had been expanded over the decades with additions that jutted out at odd angles, creating a maze-like structure that seemed to defy architectural logic. The wood was gray and weathered, the windows covered with oiled paper that had turned yellow with age. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, the only sign of life. Margaret called out a greeting but received no response. She dismounted and approached the main cabin, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hand. The door hung open, revealing a darkness within that seemed to swallow the morning light. Inside, Margaret found herself in a single large room that served as kitchen, living area, and sleeping quarters. A fire burned low in a massive stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across the walls. And there, huddled in the corners, pressed against the walls, were the Coddles. Margaret counted 11 people in that room, ranging in age from elderly to infant. But it was not their number that made her gasp and steady herself against the doorframe. It was their appearance. Nearly every member of the family bore some visible mark of affliction. Twisted limbs, elongated faces, eyes set too close together or too far apart, skin that hung loose or stretched too tight over malformed bones. And then she saw the boy. He sat in the far corner of the room, separated from the others by a crude wooden partition. Even from across the room, Margaret could see that his skin glistened with moisture. As she approached, the smell intensified, and she understood the source of the odor that had assaulted her on the path. The boy appeared to be approximately 12 years of age, though his condition made accurate estimation difficult. His entire body was covered in open sores that wept continuously, producing a yellowish fluid that soaked through his thin clothing and pooled on the wooden floor beneath him. His skin, where it was not broken by wounds, had a grayish pallor, as if the very life was being drained from his flesh. But it was his eyes that Margaret would remember until her dying day. Pale blue, almost white. They stared at her with an intelligence and awareness that seemed impossible given his physical condition. Those eyes held no self-pity, no plea for help. They simply observed, as if the boy had long ago accepted his fate and now merely waited for its conclusion. An elderly woman, her back bent nearly double with age, shuffled toward Margaret. She spoke in a dialect so thick that the nurse struggled to understand her words. "This here is Elijah," the woman said. "He'd been like this since he come into the world. The wetness, it never stops. We tried everything. Herbs, prayers, even brought a preacher up here once. Nothing works, the wetness just keeps coming." Margaret knelt beside the boy, her professional instincts overriding her horror. She had seen many terrible things in her years of nursing, but nothing had prepared her for this. The sores covered every inch of Elijah's body, and true to the old woman's words, they continued to weep even as Margaret watched. The fluid was not quite pus, not quite lymph, but something in between. A biological discharge that defied her medical training. "How long has he been this way?" Margaret asked. "Since birth," the old woman replied. "It's Mama. She died bringing him into the world. The midwife said he'd come out wet like this, and he never dried. We keep him clean best we can, but the wetness, it just keeps coming." Margaret examined the boy with trembling hands. His lymph nodes were swollen, his breathing labored, his heartbeat irregular. But beneath all these symptoms, she detected something else, a fundamental wrongness in his physical development that went beyond any disease she had studied. Over the following days, Margaret returned to Coddle Hollow repeatedly, driven by a combination of professional duty and morbid fascination. She documented everything she observed, filling notebook after notebook with her observations. And slowly, through careful questioning and patient listening, she began to piece together the terrible history of the Coddle family. The isolation had begun as a choice, but had become a prison. The first Coddles had fled some unknown trouble in Virginia, seeking a place where they could live undisturbed. They found it in this hollow, where the mountains created a natural barrier against the outside world. For the first generation, this isolation was a blessing. For those who followed, it became a curse. With no outside contact, the Coddles had turned inward. Cousins had married cousins. Then, as the generations passed and the family grew but did not expand beyond the hollow, the unions had grown closer still. Brothers and sisters, parents and children. The bloodline had folded back upon itself again and again until it had become a closed loop, a genetic nightmare that produced children like Elijah. Margaret learned that Elijah was not the first child born with afflictions in Coddle Hollow. He was merely the most severe case. Others had been born before him with similar conditions, children who wept from their skin, whose bones grew soft and bent, whose minds never developed beyond infancy. Most of these children had not survived their first years of life. Elijah's survival was considered something of a miracle by the family, though Margaret suspected it was more a testament to the resilience of human biology than any divine intervention. The condition that afflicted Elijah had no name in the medical literature of 1937. Margaret, drawing on her training and her observations, theorized that it was some form of inherited disorder affecting the skin's ability to regulate moisture. The constant weeping of his wounds was not infection, but rather a fundamental failure of his body to maintain the barrier between inside and outside. His skin, compromised by generations of genetic damage, simply could not hold his fluids within. But Margaret's investigation revealed something even more disturbing than Elijah's physical condition. She discovered that the Coddle family was not ignorant of the cause of their afflictions. The elderly woman, whose name was Prudence, eventually confided the family's darkest truth. "We know why the young ones come out wrong," Prudence admitted one evening as the autumn wind howled outside the cabin. "We always known. But what choice did we have? There was no one else up here but us. And the family had to continue. The land needed Coddles to work it, so we did what we had to do." When Margaret asked why they did not simply leave the hollow, seek partners from the outside world, Prudence's expression hardened. "Coddles belong here," she said with a finality that brooked no argument. "This is our land. Our blood is in this soil. We cannot leave, and outsiders cannot understand our ways. They would judge us. They would take our land, scatter our family. Better to suffer here than to lose everything we are." This twisted logic, this prioritization of land and legacy over the health and well-being of children, horrified Margaret more than any of the physical afflictions she had witnessed. The Coddles had made a conscious choice, generation after generation, to continue practices they knew would produce suffering. They had sacrificed their children on the altar of isolation and family pride. As October gave way to November, Margaret knew she could not keep what she had discovered to herself. The situation in Coddle Hollow was not merely a medical curiosity, but a humanitarian crisis. Children were being born into suffering, their lives predetermined by the choices of their ancestors. Something had to be done. But Margaret's attempts to involve the authorities met with unexpected resistance. The county health officer, a man named Dr. Samuel Hendricks, listened to her report with growing discomfort. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "the Coddles have been in that hollow for longer than anyone can remember. What goes on up there is their own business. We have no jurisdiction over private family matters. But the children, Margaret protested. Surely something can be done for the children. Dr. Hendricks shook his head. You are talking about interfering with one of the oldest families in the county. They pay their taxes, they do not cause trouble, and they keep to themselves. That is more than can be said for many folks around here. My advice to you is to forget what you saw and move on to families who actually want your help. Margaret left Dr. Hendricks's office in a state of frustrated fury. She understood now that the wall of silence surrounding the Coddles was not merely geographical but social. The community had tacitly agreed to ignore what was happening in the hollow, to pretend that the family did not exist, to let them continue their practices undisturbed. It was easier than confronting the uncomfortable truth. But Margaret could not forget. Every night she saw Elijah's pale eyes in her dreams. She heard the wet sound of his weeping skin, smelled the putrid odor of his constant discharge. The boy who never dried had become a symbol of everything wrong with a society that valued privacy and tradition over the welfare of its most vulnerable members. In December of 1937, Margaret made a decision that would have consequences she could not foresee. She wrote a letter to the Louisville Medical Journal describing in clinical detail what she had witnessed in Coddle Hollow. She named no names, referring to the family only as a clan in eastern Kentucky. But her account was specific enough that anyone familiar with the region would know exactly who she meant. The letter was published in the January 1938 edition of the Journal. Within weeks it had been reprinted in newspapers across the state and beyond. The story of the boy who never dried captured the public imagination in a way that Margaret had not anticipated. Suddenly, Coddle Hollow was no longer a forgotten corner of the Appalachians, but a source of national fascination and horror. Confira se J inscrito nes canal. Se voca queer conhesser as historias mais sombrias e ocultas, que a sociedade tent, apagar de memoria. Est o unico lugar voca encontrara verdade que ningua motive corrigem decanter inscrivisse agora. The publication of Margaret Whitmore's letter unleashed forces that no one could have predicted. By February of 1938, Coddle Hollow had become the most talked about location in Kentucky. Newspapers sent reporters, medical schools dispatched researchers, and curious seekers from across the country made pilgrimages to the remote mountain community. The first to arrive were the journalists. They came in automobiles that struggled up the mountain roads, their city clothes and polished shoes comically out of place in the mud and poverty of rural Appalachia. They carried cameras and notebooks, eager to document the horrors that Margaret's letter had described, but the Coddles were not welcoming hosts. When the first reporter, a young man from the Lexington Herald named Thomas Brennan, attempted to approach the homestead, he was met at the edge of the property by 3 Coddle men armed with shotguns. They said nothing, merely stood there in silent menace until Brennan retreated back down the path. This encounter only heightened public interest. The image of the secretive mountain clan, guarding their terrible secrets with weapons, fit perfectly into the narrative that had already taken hold in the public imagination. The Coddles were portrayed as something less than civilized, a throwback to a darker age when such practices were common. What the newspapers did not report was the fear that drove the Coddles' hostility. For over a century they had lived in isolation precisely to avoid the judgment of the outside world. Now that judgment had found them, and they reacted the only way they knew how, with suspicion and aggression. The medical community proved more persistent than the journalists. In March of 1938, a team from the University of Kentucky arrived in Letcher County with official authorization from the state health department. The team was led by Dr. Harrison Woolfolk, a geneticist who had been following research on inherited disorders in European journals and recognized in the Coddle case an opportunity to study similar phenomena in American populations. Dr. Woolfolk approached the situation with more diplomacy than the journalists had shown. He spent several days in Whitesburg, meeting with local officials and community leaders, explaining his intentions and soliciting their support. He made it clear that his purpose was not to expose or condemn the Coddles, but to study their condition and potentially offer medical assistance. This approach eventually bore fruit. Through a series of intermediaries, including the local minister and a distant Coddle relative who had married outside the family, Dr. Woolfolk was able to arrange a meeting with the family patriarch, a man named Jeremiah Coddle. Jeremiah was 63 years old in 1938, though he looked considerably older. His face bore the marks of the family's isolation, a pronounced underbite, eyes slightly too close together, a drooping eyelid that gave him a perpetually skeptical expression. But his mind was sharp, and he understood that the attention now focused on his family could not be dispelled with shotguns and silence. The meeting took place in the main cabin of the Coddle homestead, the same room where Margaret Whitmore had first encountered Elijah. The boy was not present, having been moved to one of the outbuildings before Dr. Woolfolk's arrival. Jeremiah was taking no chances with the outsiders. Dr. Woolfolk explained his research interests carefully, avoiding any language that might suggest judgment or condemnation. He spoke of inherited conditions, of the scientific importance of understanding how certain traits passed from generation to generation, of the possibility that his research might lead to treatments that could help future Coddle children. Jeremiah listened in silence, his one good eye fixed on the doctor's face. When Woolfolk finished, the old man spoke. "You want to study us like we are some kind of animals," he said. "You want to put us in your journals and your books so other folks can point and stare?" Dr. Woolfolk shook his head. "I want to understand what has happened to your family so that we can prevent it from happening to others. What I have heard about the boy, about Elijah, suggests a condition that causes great suffering. If we can understand what causes that suffering, perhaps we can find a way to ease it." Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and walked to the door of the cabin. "Come with me," he said. Dr. Woolfolk followed Jeremiah across the clearing to one of the smaller outbuildings. Inside, in the dim light that filtered through a single small window, Elijah sat on a cot covered with layers of cloth that had been soaked through with his constant discharge. The sight stopped Dr. Woolfolk in his tracks. He had read Margaret Whitmore's description, had prepared himself for what he would see, but nothing could have truly prepared him for the reality of Elijah's condition. The boy's entire body glistened with moisture, his thin clothing plastered to his skin, his hair matted against his skull. The smell was overwhelming, a thick biological odor that seemed to coat the inside of the doctor's nostrils. But it was Elijah's expression that affected Dr. Woolfolk most deeply. The boy looked up at him with those pale, intelligent eyes, and in them the doctor saw not suffering but resignation. This child had never known any other existence. His constant weeping, his isolation from even his own family, the stares and whispers of those rare outsiders who saw him, all of this was simply his life. He had nothing to compare it to, no baseline of normalcy against which to measure his misery. "This is what your science wants to study," Jeremiah said, his voice flat. "This is my grandson. His mother was my daughter. His father was my son." The words hung in the air, their full implication taking a moment to register. Dr. Woolfolk turned to face Jeremiah, struggling to keep his expression neutral. "I see," he said carefully. "Do you?" Jeremiah's voice carried a challenge. "Do you see what it is like to watch your children suffer because of choices that were made long before any of us were born? My grandfather made the decision to stay in this hollow, to keep the family together no matter what. He did not know what would happen. None of them did. By the time they understood, it was too late. The damage was done. And now every generation pays for that decision, Doctor." Woolfolk spent the next 3 months in Letcher County, conducting what would become one of the most comprehensive studies of hereditary disorders in an isolated American population ever undertaken at that time. With Jeremiah's reluctant permission, he examined and documented every member of the Coddle family, recording their physical characteristics, their medical histories, and their genealogical relationships. What he discovered confirmed the worst of Margaret Whitmore's suspicions. The Coddle family tree was not a tree at all, but a web, with lines of descent crossing and recrossing until the relationships became almost impossible to untangle. Cousins had married cousins for so long that by the 1930s, every union within the family was between relatives who shared a significant portion of their hereditary material. The effects of this genetic bottleneck were visible throughout the family. Shortened limbs, curved spines, misshapen skulls, impaired vision, reduced mental capacity. All of these afflictions appeared in various combinations among the Coddles. But Elijah's condition represented the most extreme manifestation, a perfect storm of inherited defects that had produced a child whose very skin could not function properly. Dr. Woolfolk's report, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in late 1938, introduced the term Coddle syndrome to describe Elijah's specific condition. He theorized that the disorder resulted from the inheritance of 2 copies of a recessive gene that affected the skin's ability to maintain its structural integrity. In most populations, carriers of this gene would never encounter another carrier, and the disorder would never manifest. But in the closed genetic pool of Coddle Hollow, both copies of the gene had come together in Elijah, producing his devastating condition. The publication of Dr. Woolfolk's report brought another wave of attention to the family. This time, however, the interest was more clinical than sensational. Medical students and researchers from across the country wrote to Dr. Woolfolk requesting more information, asking if they could visit the family, wondering if tissue samples might be available for study. But for the Coddles themselves, the attention brought no benefit. They remained in their hollow, trapped by tradition and geography, watching as their youngest members continued to suffer the consequences of decisions made a century before. Elijah's condition, far from improving with medical attention, continued to deteriorate. By the summer of 1938, he was bedridden, too weak to sit up, his body slowly losing the battle against its own dysfunction. Dr. Woolfolk made one final visit to Coddle Hollow in August of that year. He found Elijah in the same outbuilding, but the boy had changed dramatically. His discharge had increased, his skin now sloughing off in sheets, revealing raw tissue beneath. The smell was almost unbearable. "There is nothing more I can do," Dr. Woolfolk told Jeremiah. "The boy is beyond medical help. All we can do now is keep him comfortable." Jeremiah nodded, unsurprised. "We have been keeping him comfortable his whole life," he said. "That is all any of us can do for each other." Elijah Coddle passed away on September 14, 1938, at the age of 13. His death certificate, signed by a local physician who had never actually examined him, listed the cause of death as natural causes. There was no autopsy, no further study. The boy who never dried was buried in the family cemetery behind the main cabin, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross that would rot away within a decade. But Elijah's story did not end with his death. The attention his case had brought to the issue of hereditary disorders in isolated communities sparked a broader conversation about the practices that led to such suffering. In the following years, state legislatures across the country would pass laws prohibiting marriages between close relatives, laws that had not existed or had not been enforced in many rural areas. The Coddle family itself would not survive much longer as a distinct community. The younger generation, having seen the outside world's reaction to their way of life, began to leave the hollow one by one. Some married outsiders, diluting the genetic pool that had caused so much suffering. Others simply disappeared into the anonymity of growing cities like Lexington and Louisville, abandoning the land that their ancestors had prized above the health of their own children. By 1950, only a handful of elderly Coddles remained in the hollow. The cabins fell into disrepair, the fields returned to forest, and the terrible legacy of the family began to fade from public memory. Today, Coddle Hollow is just another abandoned homestead in the Appalachian Mountains, its history known only to a few historians and medical researchers who still cite Dr. Woolfolk's study in their work. Margaret Whitmore never fully recovered from what she witnessed in Coddle Hollow. Her letter to the Louisville Medical Journal had been written in a spirit of professional obligation, a belief that the medical community needed to know about the conditions she had encountered. She had not anticipated the circus that would follow. The reporters and researchers and curiosity seekers who descended on the hollow, transforming the Coddles from a suffering family into a public spectacle. In the months after her letter's publication, Margaret received hundreds of letters from across the country. Some praised her courage in speaking out. Others condemned her for exposing a private family's shame to public ridicule. A few, the ones that disturbed her most, asked for directions to Coddle Hollow, expressing a desire to see the boy who never dried for themselves. Margaret answered none of these letters. She continued her work as a traveling nurse, visiting the poorest communities in eastern Kentucky, treating ailments that ranged from malnutrition to black lung disease. But she never returned to Coddle Hollow. She could not bear to see what her revelation had wrought. The guilt weighed on her heavily. She had believed that exposure would bring help, that once the world knew about the Coddles' suffering, resources and assistance would follow. Instead, exposure had brought only humiliation. The family had become a cautionary tale, a horror story told to frighten children and reinforce social taboos. No one spoke of helping the Coddles. They only spoke of the terrible things the Coddles had done to themselves. In the spring of 1939, Margaret received a letter that stood out from the others. It was written in a careful, educated hand, and it bore no return address. The letter was from someone who claimed to have grown up in a similar community, an isolated hollow in the mountains of West Virginia where the same practices had produced the same results. The writer, who signed only as a former child of the hollow, described experiences that mirrored what Margaret had witnessed among the Coddles. Brothers and sisters who were also husbands and wives. Children born with deformities that made normal life impossible. A community that knew what it was doing was wrong but saw no alternative. But the letter also contained something Margaret had not expected, a defense of these communities. "You see only the suffering," the writer explained. "You do not see what drove these families to such extremes. The isolation was not a choice but a necessity. We were hated by the outside world long before we turned inward. The mountain people were always treated as less than human by those in the flatlands. Our accents were mocked, Our poverty was scorned, our customs were ridiculed. When we sought to join the broader society, we were rejected. So we retreated into our hollows and our valleys, and we made do with what we had. What you call practices against nature, we called survival. The letter continued for several pages, describing a history of discrimination and marginalization that had pushed these communities into isolation. The writer did not excuse the consequences of that isolation, the genetic damage, the suffering children. But they asked Margaret to consider whether the blame lay entirely with the families themselves or with the society that had rejected them. Margaret read this letter many times over the following weeks. It challenged her assumptions, forced her to reconsider the simple narrative of ignorant mountain folk engaging in forbidden practices. The reality, she began to understand, was far more complex. The Coddles and families like them were not merely perpetrators of their own misery, but also victims of a broader social failure. This understanding, however, brought Margaret no peace. If anything, it deepened her guilt. She had contributed to the stigmatization of communities that were already marginalized, had added her voice to the chorus of judgment and condemnation that had driven them into isolation in the first place. Her letter had not helped the Coddles. It had only confirmed in the public mind that they were monsters, aberrations, examples of what happened when people strayed from civilized norms. Se esta historia está tocando su coração de alguma forma, DXM comentario dizendo, Elisha Maricuama chance de viver como qualquer outra criança, mostra que voca se importa como qualsque nunca tiveram voz. In the autumn of 1939, Margaret made a decision. She would dedicate the rest of her career to helping isolated communities, without exposing them to the judgment of the outside world. She would provide medical care quietly, without fanfare, without publication, without attracting the attention that had proven so destructive to the Coddles. For the next 30 years, Margaret Whitmore traveled through the most remote regions of Appalachia, treating patients who had never seen a trained medical professional, delivering babies in cabins without electricity or running water, setting broken bones and stitching wounds, and providing whatever comfort she could to those who had been forgotten by modern society. She encountered other families like the Coddles during these years, communities where isolation and necessity had produced unions that the outside world would condemn, children who bore the physical marks of generations of closed breeding. She treated them all with the same compassion, the same discretion, the same refusal to judge, but she never forgot Elijah. His pale eyes haunted her dreams until the end of her life. She saw him as he had been when she first encountered him, sitting in that corner, his skin weeping endlessly, watching her with an intelligence that seemed to understand everything, his own condition, his family's history, the impossibility of escape. That gaze followed her through the decades, a silent accusation and a plea for forgiveness. Margaret Whitmore died in 1971 at the age of 68. She had never married, never had children of her own, never spoken publicly about the Coddles after her initial letter. Her personal papers, discovered after her death, included notebooks filled with observations from her years of service. But these notebooks had been carefully edited to remove any identifying information about the families she had treated. Among her papers was also a single photograph, yellowed with age, showing a young boy sitting on a wooden chair. The boy's face was blurred, his features indistinct, but the wet stains on his clothing were clearly visible. On the back of the photograph, in Margaret's handwriting, were 2 words: "Forgive me." The study of hereditary disorders in isolated populations did not end with Dr. Woolfolk's 1938 report on the Coddles. In the decades that followed, geneticists and medical researchers would return again and again to communities like Coddle Hollow, seeking to understand how certain traits passed from generation to generation and why isolation produced such devastating effects. In the 1940s and 50s, as the science of genetics advanced rapidly, researchers developed new tools for understanding hereditary conditions. They traced the patterns of inheritance through family trees, identified the specific mechanisms by which certain disorders were transmitted, and began to understand why closed breeding populations were at such elevated risk. The key insight was the concept of recessive genes. Every person carries 2 copies of most genes, one inherited from each parent. For most traits, these genes work together, with one often dominating over the other. But some genes only produce their effects when a person inherits the same version from both parents. These recessive traits can be hidden for generations, passed silently from parent to child until 2 carriers happen to have children together. In a large, diverse population, the chances of 2 carriers of the same rare recessive gene finding each other are extremely small. But in an isolated community where everyone is related to everyone else, these chances increase dramatically. As generations pass and the genetic pool shrinks, more and more harmful recessive traits begin to appear, each one a legacy of ancestors who never knew they carried the potential for suffering in their very cells. Elijah Coddle's condition, which Dr. Woolfolk had termed Coddle syndrome, was later understood to be a severe form of a disorder affecting the skin's barrier function. The gene responsible, when inherited from only one parent, produced no symptoms, but when inherited from both parents, as it was in Elijah's case, it caused the skin to lose its ability to maintain the boundary between the body's interior and the outside world. The constant weeping of his wounds was his body's fluids escaping through a barrier that could not hold them in. By the 1960s, researchers had identified dozens of similar conditions associated with closed breeding populations. Some affected the skin, others the bones, still others the brain and nervous system. Each represented a different genetic accident, a different combination of recessive genes that had come together in individuals whose parents shared too much hereditary material. These findings had practical implications for public health policy. States that had not already done so passed laws restricting marriages between close relatives. Public education campaigns warned about the dangers of such unions. Medical professionals were trained to recognize the signs of hereditary disorders and to counsel families about the risks. But for communities like the Coddles, these interventions came too late. The damage had been done over generations, encoded in the very genes of every surviving family member. Even those who left the hollow and married outsiders carried the potential for suffering within them, recessive traits that might emerge in future generations when chance brought two carriers together again. The ethical questions raised by the Coddle case and others like it continue to challenge researchers and policymakers today. How should society respond to communities whose traditional practices cause harm to children? What is the balance between respecting cultural autonomy and protecting vulnerable individuals? Who bears responsibility for suffering that results from choices made generations ago? These questions have no easy answers. The Coddles did not choose their isolation freely, but were driven to it by poverty, discrimination, and the geographic barriers of the Appalachian Mountains. Once isolated, they made choices that seemed necessary for survival, unaware of the consequences those choices would have for their descendants. By the time those consequences became clear, it was too late to undo them. The broader society, too, bears some responsibility. The marginalization of mountain communities, the failure to provide education and healthcare to remote populations, the prejudice that made integration impossible. All of these factors contributed to the conditions that produced the Coddle's suffering. To simply condemn the family while ignoring these broader forces is to miss the larger lesson of their tragedy. In the decades since Elijah's death, the study of hereditary disorders has advanced enormously. Scientists can now identify specific genetic variations associated with hundreds of conditions. Genetic counseling helps prospective parents understand their risks. Prenatal testing allows some disorders to be detected before birth. These advances have prevented countless cases of suffering, but the fundamental ethical dilemmas remain unresolved. Every technological advance raises new questions. Should genetic information be used to prevent the birth of children with certain conditions? Who decides which conditions are severe enough to warrant intervention? How do we balance the rights of individuals to make their own reproductive choices against society's interest in preventing suffering? The ghost of Elijah Coddle hovers over these debates, a reminder of what can happen when nature and circumstance combine to produce outcomes that no one intended. His short life was marked by constant physical suffering, but his true tragedy was the inevitability of his fate. From the moment of his conception, his future was sealed by the genetic lottery of his closed community. He never had a chance. The road to what was once Coddle Hollow is barely visible now. Overgrown with decades of vegetation, its path marked only by the slight depression where countless feet and hooves once traveled. The few people who still know the location rarely visit, and those who stumble upon it by accident usually leave quickly, unnerved by the strange atmosphere that lingers among the ruins. The cabins have collapsed, their wooden beams rotted through, their roofs fallen in, their interiors reclaimed by the forest. The clearing where the Coddles once gathered has been swallowed by trees and underbrush, leaving no trace of the lives that were lived there. Even the family cemetery is nearly impossible to find, its wooden markers long since decayed, its graves unmarked by any permanent memorial. But the story of the Coddles has not been entirely forgotten. In the archives of the University of Kentucky, Dr. Harrison Woolfolk's original research materials are preserved, including his handwritten notes, his genealogical charts, and a few photographs that he took during his time in the Hollow. These materials are occasionally consulted by researchers studying the history of genetics or the social dynamics of isolated communities. Margaret Whitmore's letter to the Louisville Medical Journal is still cited in medical literature, though usually as an example of early case reporting rather than for its specific findings. Her description of Elijah's condition remains one of the most detailed accounts of severe inherited skin disorder from the pre-modern era of genetics. The descendants of the Coddles who left the Hollow are scattered across the country now, most of them unaware of their ancestry or deliberately concealing it. A few have returned to Kentucky in recent years, drawn by a genealogical curiosity or a desire to understand their roots. What they find is usually disappointing: a few crumbling ruins, a handful of aging documents, and a community that would rather forget the Coddle name than remember it. The condition that afflicted Elijah is still occasionally seen in modern medical practice, though effective treatments now exist for managing its symptoms. Children born with similar disorders today can expect to live relatively normal lives, their skin condition controlled by medications and specialized care that was unavailable in 1937. The suffering that defined Elijah's existence has become, in most cases, a manageable chronic condition. But the broader issues that the Coddle case raised remain as relevant as ever. Isolated communities still exist in the mountains of Appalachia and elsewhere, where traditional practices and limited access to education and healthcare create conditions similar to those that produced the Coddle's tragedy. The genetic risks of close marriages are now well understood. But understanding does not always translate into behavioral change, especially in communities that distrust outside authority. The story of the boy who never dried is ultimately a story about the consequences of isolation, both chosen and imposed. The Coddles isolated themselves to escape a world that rejected them, and in doing so, they created conditions that would cause unimaginable suffering to their descendants. The world that rejected them then turned its gaze upon their suffering, not to help but to gawk, transforming their private tragedy into public entertainment. Elijah Coddle lived only 13 years, most of them in constant physical distress, separated from even his own family by a condition that made normal human contact impossible. He never attended school, never had friends outside the Hollow, never experienced any of the ordinary pleasures of childhood. His existence was defined entirely by his affliction, by the wet skin that would not dry, by the odor that drove others away, by the isolation within isolation that was his daily reality. And yet, by all accounts, he faced his fate with remarkable equanimity. Margaret Whitmore noted the intelligence in his eyes, the lack of self-pity, the quiet acceptance. Dr. Woolfolk observed that Elijah seemed to understand his situation more clearly than the adults around him, accepting what could not be changed while making the most of what little was available to him. Perhaps this acceptance was Elijah's greatest achievement, finding peace in circumstances that would have driven others to despair. Or perhaps it was simply the adaptation of a mind that had never known anything different, a survival mechanism that protected him from the full weight of his tragedy. We cannot know what Elijah truly felt, what thoughts passed through his mind during the long hours he spent alone in that outbuilding, his body weeping endlessly, the world beyond the Hollow as unreachable as the stars. What we can know is that his suffering was not inevitable. It was the product of choices made by human beings, choices that were constrained by poverty and prejudice and ignorance, but that were choices nonetheless. And understanding that his suffering was preventable is perhaps the most important lesson of his story. For if the tragedy of Elijah Coddle was created by human choices, then human choices can prevent similar tragedies in the future. The Hollow that time forgot still exists, hidden in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, slowly being erased by the relentless growth of the forest. Within a few more decades, there will be nothing left to mark the place where the Coddles lived and suffered and died. The boy who never dried will be truly forgotten then, his story surviving only in medical journals and historical archives, a footnote in the long history of human genetics. But perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the best memorial for Elijah Coddle is not a marker in an overgrown cemetery, but the knowledge that his suffering contributed to changes that have prevented countless others from sharing his fate. The laws against close marriages, the genetic counseling services, the prenatal testing that identifies high-risk pregnancies, all of these exist in part because of cases like Elijah's. Because his tragedy forced society to confront uncomfortable truths it would have preferred to ignore. In this sense, Elijah's life had meaning beyond his own suffering. He became unwillingly and unknowingly a catalyst for change, a symbol of what can go wrong when isolation and tradition override the health and well-being of children. His pale eyes staring out from the shadows of that Appalachian hollow still challenge us to do better, to ensure that no child ever again suffers as he suffered. The mountains of eastern Kentucky are quiet now. The hollows and valleys that once sheltered isolated communities like the Coddles, largely empty of human habitation. The people who live there have scattered, seeking better lives in cities and suburbs where their origins are unknown and their family histories can be safely forgotten. The practices that produced Elijah Coddle have faded into memory, replaced by laws and social norms that make such tragedies increasingly rare. But the potential for similar suffering remains encoded in human genes, waiting to emerge whenever circumstances allow. The story of the boy who never dried is a warning from the past, a reminder of what can happen when we turn away from those who need our help, when we allow prejudice and isolation to flourish, when we prioritize tradition over the welfare of the most vulnerable among us. Elijah Coddle has been dead for nearly 90 years now. His grave is unmarked and unknown, his remains long since returned to the mountain soil that his family valued above all else. But his story endures, a testament to human suffering and human resilience. A challenge to create a world where no child is ever born into such hopeless circumstances. The boy who never dried, his pus-covered flesh that spread panic through the Appalachians. He lived, he suffered, and he died, but his legacy lives on, a warning and a plea. Echoing through the mountains and the decades, asking us to remember, asking us to learn, asking us to ensure that his tragedy was not in vain.